The following scenario is hypothetical and presented for educational and entertainment purposes. The most terrifying monster in history may not have claws, fangs, or glowing red eyes. It might not lurk in forests or swim in dark oceans. In fact, it may be lying perfectly still in a stainless steel cylinder cooled to temperatures colder than Antarctica, waiting patiently for the future to arrive. That idea sounds like the plot of a late-night science fiction movie. Yet somewhere in the deserts of the United States, inside facilities that look more like quiet warehouses than laboratories of destiny, dozens of human bodies are currently stored in vats of liquid nitrogen at minus 196 degrees Celsius. They are not officially dead, at least not according to the people preserving them. Instead, they are considered patients. Their illness? Time itself. Welcome to the strange and controversial world of cryogenics, the science, or depending on who you ask, the dream, of freezing humans today so that future technology can bring them back to life. Now, before you imagine a sci-fi chamber that instantly freezes someone like a popsicle in a cartoon, the real process is far more complicated and much more unsettling. When a person legally dies, a cryonics team moves quickly. Within minutes, the body is cooled with ice to slow cellular decay. Blood is replaced with special chemicals called cryoprotectants, substances designed to prevent ice crystals from forming. Ice crystals are microscopic assassins. If they grow inside cells, they puncture membranes and destroy delicate biological structures, especially in the brain. And the brain, of course, is the real prize. From a neurological perspective, the human brain is less like a hard drive and more like a living city of electrical connections. Roughly 86 billion neurons communicate through trillions of synapses, encoding memories, personality, fears, dreams, embarrassing childhood moments, and the password you keep forgetting. The entire story of who you are exists in that fragile network. Cryonics supporters believe that if this network, the structure of the brain, is preserved well enough, then future science might someday repair the damage and restart the system. Imagine nanotechnology repairing cells atom by atom, or advanced regenerative medicine rebuilding tissues the way software restores corrupted files. It sounds impossible today, but so did heart transplants, antibiotics, and Wi-Fi that somehow reaches the bathroom. But here's where things start to get eerie. Recent neuroscience research suggests that memory may survive certain types of biological shutdown longer than previously thought. Experiments with small organisms and preserved neural tissue have shown that structural patterns in the brain can remain intact even after metabolic activity stops. In other words, death might not be the clean, irreversible switch we once believed it to be. Instead, it could be more like a paused program. And if that idea is even partially true, cryonics stops sounding like science fiction and starts sounding like an extremely risky, extremely expensive scientific bet. Of course, critics argue something important. Freezing a brain is not the same as preserving a mind. Cryoprotectants themselves can be toxic. The freezing process can still cause microscopic fractures, and reviving a frozen human would require technologies that simply do not exist yet. But that's only the biological side of the story. The truly strange part begins when we consider the psychological implications. Imagine waking up 200 years in the future. Everyone you know is gone. Your culture has vanished. Your language may even be outdated. The world might look as alien to you as another planet. From a cognitive science perspective, identity is deeply tied to social context. Strip that context away, and the brain can experience severe disorientation, trauma, or even complete psychological collapse. In other words, the greatest danger of cryonics might not be freezing the body. It might be what happens to the mind after it wakes up. But all of that, the science, the neuroscience, the philosophical nightmare, is still just the beginning of the mystery. Because buried inside the history of cryonics is a much darker question scientists rarely say out loud. What if freezing humans doesn't just preserve life? What if it preserves something else entirely? For a long time, scientists believed that once the brain stopped receiving oxygen, the story of a human being ended within minutes. Neurons would starve, synapses would collapse, and the intricate electrical symphony that created consciousness would fade into silence. Case closed. Curtains down. Roll credits. Cryonics quietly challenges that assumption. Not loudly, not dramatically, more like a scientist nervously raising their hand in the back of the room and saying, are we sure about that? Because modern neuroscience has uncovered something strange about the brain. Structure matters more than activity. When you are awake, billions of neurons fire constantly, generating thoughts, emotions, and the sudden urge to check your phone for absolutely no reason. But the actual information that defines you, your memories, personality traits, habits, favorite foods, irrational fear of spiders, is believed to be encoded in the physical architecture of neural connections. Think of it like a city. Electricity flowing through the streets represents neural activity. But the city itself, the roads, intersections, buildings, and bridges, is the brain's structural wiring. If the electricity shuts off, the city still exists. Turn the power back on, and activity can theoretically resume. Cryonics operates on that exact premise. The goal isn't to keep the brain alive today. The goal is simply to preserve the map. But preserving that map turns out to be much harder than early cryonics enthusiasts imagined. When water freezes, it expands. Ice crystals form sharp microscopic edges that shred cell membranes like tiny knives. If you froze a human brain the same way you freeze ice cream, you'd essentially create the neurological equivalent of a snow globe filled with confetti. Not ideal for future resurrection. So cryonics researchers use a process called vitrification. Instead of freezing the brain into solid ice, cryoprotectant chemicals replace much of the water inside cells, turning the tissue into something closer to glass. Glass. Under extreme cold, the brain becomes a solid, glass-like structure, preserving the microscopic arrangement of neurons without forming destructive crystals. It sounds elegant. It also sounds mildly terrifying, because when scientists examine vitrified brain tissue under powerful microscopes, they sometimes see something astonishing. The neural architecture can remain remarkably intact. Synapses, axons, dendrites, all the fragile structures that store the blueprint of a person's identity appear frozen in time. This is where the conversation becomes deeply uncomfortable for traditional definitions of death. If the structural information that defines a person still exists, even though the brain is inactive, have they truly disappeared? Or are they more like a paused recording waiting for technology capable of pressing play? Philosophers love this question. Doctors, not so much. But the brain is not just a storage device. It's also an experience generator, constantly updating itself through chemical signals and electrical rhythms. Even if cryonics preserves the structure perfectly, restarting consciousness would require rebooting one of the most complex systems in the known universe. To revive a cryonically preserved person, future scientists would need to repair cellular damage, restore metabolism, reconnect broken synapses, and restart neural activity in a way that recreates the original mind. That's not a medical procedure. That's basically rebuilding a human being molecule by molecule. And yet, some neuroscientists privately admit something unsettling. None of this violates the known laws of physics. We simply don't know how to do it. Yet. But if the technical challenge weren't difficult enough, there's another problem lurking quietly beneath the science. One that researchers rarely discuss outside closed conferences. A neurological paradox. Because even if you could repair every cell, restore every neuron, and perfectly rebuild the brain, how do you prove the mind that wakes up is the same person? Is it truly you, or just a flawless copy that inherited your memories? This question might sound philosophical, but for cryonics it becomes dangerously practical. Because if the original consciousness is gone forever, then cryonics isn't resurrection. It's replacement. And the deeper scientists study the brain, the more unsettling that possibility becomes. But the real twist in this story isn't about the future. It's about something researchers discovered when studying brains that had already been frozen. Something that suggested consciousness might behave in a way we never expected. Something that made a few neuroscientists quietly wonder whether the brain is capable of remembering more than just a lifetime. If the previous idea made you slightly uncomfortable, don't worry. You're not alone. Even among neuroscientists, the concept that a brain could be preserved like a biological time capsule already feels strange enough. But the deeper researchers dig into the mechanics of memory and consciousness, the stranger the story becomes. Because the brain does not store memories the way a computer stores files. There is no single memory folder labeled first day of school, like another called embarrassing teenage phase, and a secret encrypted directory containing why you still think about that one awkward conversation from 2009. Instead, memories are distributed across vast networks of neurons. Each experience slightly reshapes the strength of synaptic connections, subtly rewiring the brain over time. This process is known as synaptic plasticity, one of the fundamental principles of neuroscience. Every time you learn something, remember something, or even imagine something, the brain physically changes. Tiny molecular adjustments strengthen or weaken connections between neurons, creating patterns that encode information. In a sense, you are not just using your brain, you are constantly rewriting it. Now imagine what cryonics is attempting to do. Instead of preserving an organism that is alive and functioning, cryonics tries to freeze the brain at a particular moment in its ever-changing structure. It's like pausing an incredibly complicated movie halfway through a frame and hoping future technology can resume playback without losing the plot. And here's where things become scientifically fascinating and slightly eerie. Over the past few decades, researchers studying preserved neural tissue have discovered that structural patterns in the brain can remain surprisingly stable after biological activity stops. In laboratory conditions, delicate neural circuits have been observed maintaining their architecture long after metabolism ceased. In other words, the brain's map can sometimes survive longer than the brain itself. For cryonics advocates, this is encouraging news. If the structural encoding of memory remains intact, then theoretically the information that defines a person might still exist, frozen in place like a fossilized mind. But not everyone finds that comforting. Because preserving a brain structure raises an unsettling philosophical possibility. The brain might not only store memories, it might also store the potential for consciousness. Think of a musical instrument sitting silently in a room. The music isn't playing, but the structure capable of producing it still exists. All it needs is the right conditions, the right energy, and perhaps a very patient musician from the future. Now imagine billions of frozen instruments waiting for someone to play them again. Suddenly, cryonics stops sounding like a quirky fringe experiment and begins to resemble something far more ambitious. A library of paused human lives. And the scale of the idea becomes enormous. Some cryonics organizations already preserve not just bodies, but also neuro-only patients, people whose brains have been surgically separated and stored independently to maximize preservation quality. Their reasoning is brutally pragmatic. If the brain contains the identity, preserving the rest of the body is optional. To some scientists, that decision crosses a deeply uncomfortable line, because at that point, the human body becomes less important than the information stored inside the brain. And once you start thinking about humans as information patterns, a strange possibility emerges. Information, unlike biological tissue, can theoretically be copied. This is where the debate quietly explodes inside neuroscience and philosophy departments around the world. If future technology can scan the preserved neural structure of a cryonically stored brain and reconstruct the same pattern digitally or biologically, then the resulting consciousness might behave exactly like the original person. Same memories, same personality, same terrible taste in karaoke songs. But would it truly be the same individual, or simply a perfect reconstruction? The distinction might sound subtle, but it carries enormous consequences. Because if identity is just information, then cryonics doesn't necessarily guarantee survival. It might only guarantee replication. And that realization leads to a much darker question that cryonics companies rarely advertise in their brochures. If rebuilding a human mind from preserved brain patterns becomes possible, what stops scientists from doing it more than once? What stops them from creating multiple versions of the same person? And if that ever happened, which one would be the real you? The one in a new body? The one in a digital simulation? Or the frozen original still waiting in a metal cylinder somewhere underground? These questions might sound like philosophical science fiction, but they connect directly to the deeper mystery researchers have begun to confront. Because when scientists examine preserved neural structures closely enough, they sometimes notice something odd about the patterns left behind. Not damage, not decay, but unexpected stability in areas of the brain that should have degraded faster. Patterns that seem unusually persistent, almost as if certain parts of the brain are designed to resist disappearing. And if that observation turns out to be true, it raises a chilling possibility that very few researchers are willing to say aloud. What if the brain isn't just a machine that produces consciousness? What if it's also a container that can hold it far longer than we ever imagined? Most people imagine death as a precise moment, a flat line on a monitor, a final breath, a quiet declaration from a doctor. But biology rarely works with such clean endings. In reality, death is more like a slow systems shutdown. Different parts of the body fail at different times, and the brain, ironically the organ most associated with consciousness, sometimes lingers in strange transitional states before everything finally goes dark. For decades, this gray zone between life and death was mostly ignored by science. It was messy, difficult to study, and ethically complicated. But in recent years, researchers have started investigating it more closely, and the results have been unsettling. Because the brain does not always stop all at once. In controlled laboratory experiments, scientists monitoring neural activity in dying brains have occasionally detected brief surges of organized electrical activity shortly after circulation stops. Instead of fading smoothly into silence, the brain sometimes produces one last burst of synchronized signals, almost like a system rebooting. Some neuroscientists believe this could explain reports from people who experienced near-death experiences, those vivid memories of tunnels, lights, or strangely peaceful sensations. When oxygen drops, neural circuits can behave unpredictably, producing powerful sensory illusions. But others noticed something that made the situation much more intriguing. The patterns observed during these bursts sometimes resemble coordinated brain activity normally associated with conscious awareness. That does not mean the person is fully conscious after death, but it suggests something important. The brain may retain a surprising capacity for organized activity even as biological systems collapse. Now place that idea next to cryonics. Cryonics attempts to intervene precisely during this fragile transition period, after legal death, but before large-scale cellular destruction occurs. The goal is to halt decay quickly enough that the microscopic structures responsible for memory and identity remain preserved. Think of it like freezing a computer before the hard drive physically melts. But the timing matters enormously. Too early, and the procedure would be illegal. Too late, and the brain structure begins to deteriorate beyond repair. Cryonics teams therefore operate in a narrow window measured in minutes, racing against biochemical processes that begin dismantling cells almost immediately. Inside the brain, enzymes begin breaking down proteins. Cell membranes lose integrity. Molecular gradients collapse. It's less like turning off a machine and more like watching a city slowly crumble. Yet under extremely cold conditions, those destructive reactions slow dramatically. At -196 degrees Celsius, the temperature of liquid nitrogen used in cryonics, most biochemical activity nearly stops. Molecules barely move. Chemical reactions crawl to a halt. Time, in a very real sense, becomes almost irrelevant. From a purely physical standpoint, a vitrified brain stored at these temperatures could theoretically remain structurally stable for centuries or even millennia, which means the information defining a person, the arrangement of neurons and synapses, might survive far longer than their biological lifespan ever allowed. But this is where the story takes a darker turn, because preserving a brain indefinitely creates a problem scientists rarely discuss publicly, if cryonics ever works, even once. Then every preserved brain becomes a moral time bomb. Think about it. Right now, cryonics patients exist in a strange legal limbo. They are declared dead by today's medical standards, yet preserved with the expectation that future technology might revive them. They are not exactly alive, but they are not fully gone either. They are something new, a suspended category of human existence. And if future medicine eventually gains the ability to repair frozen tissue, regenerate organs, and restart brain activity, then society will face a question that no legal system has ever had to answer before. Do we have an obligation to bring them back? Because once revival becomes possible, leaving someone frozen indefinitely might no longer be a technical limitation. It might become a choice. And choices about who returns from the past and who stays buried in cold storage could reshape ethics, economics, and even the concept of death itself. Imagine thousands of preserved individuals from different centuries suddenly becoming viable candidates for resurrection. Scientists, artists, engineers, billionaires who planned ahead, and maybe a few ordinary people who simply hoped the future would be kinder than the present. At first, the idea sounds exciting, almost heroic. Humanity conquering death with technology. But buried within that dream lies the second great climax of the cryonics story. Because if the future can wake the frozen, it may also gain the power to decide who deserves to wake up at all. And that decision could turn cryonics from a scientific gamble into something far more dangerous than anyone expected. Because the most terrifying possibility isn't that cryonics fails, it's that one day it finally works. For most of human history, death was simple. Not emotionally simple, of course. Losing someone has never been easy, but conceptually simple. A person lived, their body eventually failed, and the story ended. Cultures created rituals, religions offered explanations, and societies quietly agreed on one shared assumption. When death happens, the chapter is closed. Cryonics tears a hole in that assumption. Not a dramatic explosion, more like a slow crack spreading across the foundation of how we define life itself. Because if technology eventually becomes capable of repairing frozen tissue, restoring brain function, and reviving a preserved person, then death stops being a permanent boundary. Instead, it becomes something much stranger, a reversible condition under the right circumstances. And the moment that possibility enters the conversation, everything changes. Imagine the first successful revival. A patient frozen decades earlier is carefully warmed, cellular damage repaired by advanced nanotechnology or molecular medicine. Blood circulation returns. Neural circuits begin firing again. The brain, once vitrified like glass, slowly reactivates its ancient electrical patterns. Somewhere in a laboratory room, a person who legally died half a century ago opens their eyes. For a few seconds, the world would likely fall silent. Then the real consequences would begin. Because the scientific challenge of revival is only the beginning. The psychological and societal shock that follows might be even harder to manage. Think about the brain waking up. From its perspective, the last memory might be lying in a hospital bed surrounded by worried relatives, a doctor speaking softly, a final breath. Then, darkness. And suddenly a completely different world. New languages, new technologies, new social norms, entire generations of cultural change compressed into what feels like a single night of sleep. The human brain evolved to adapt to gradual change, not temporal teleportation across decades or centuries. The psychological stress could be enormous. Studies on people who experience extreme disorientation, such as survivors of long comas or severe amnesia, show that identity depends heavily on continuity. When that continuity breaks, individuals often struggle to reconstruct their sense of self. Now imagine that disruption multiplied by 100. Cryonics revival wouldn't just be medical resuscitation, it would be historical relocation. The person waking up would essentially be an immigrant from the past. But that isn't the most unsettling implication. The real danger appears when we step back and look at the system cryonics quietly creates. Every preserved brain is a deferred decision waiting in cold storage, a decision for future generations. Should they revive everyone? Only some? Only those whose families can afford the procedure? Only historically important individuals? Only people with valuable knowledge? Cryonics companies today often frame their mission as an act of hope, giving people a chance to see the future. But in reality, they are also creating a long-term ethical burden for societies that do not yet exist. Future civilizations may inherit warehouses filled with frozen human minds, thousands of paused lives, thousands of unfinished stories. And those societies will have to answer questions we are only beginning to imagine. Who owns the revived person's identity? What legal rights do they have? Do they inherit property from families long gone? Are they citizens of a country that may no longer exist? Or something even stranger? If technology eventually becomes powerful enough to rebuild a brain from preserved neural patterns, the future might not need the original biological tissue at all. The information stored inside could be used to reconstruct the same mind in a new biological body, or even inside a digital system. At that point, cryonics stops being about freezing humans. It becomes about archiving consciousness. And that realization leads us back to the strange idea we began with, the monster hiding quietly inside a metal cylinder. Not a creature with claws or teeth, but something far more disruptive. A technology capable of breaking the oldest rule in biology. Because if cryonics ever succeeds, even once, humanity will face a new and deeply uncomfortable truth. The boundary between life and death was never as solid as we believed. It was only frozen in place by the limits of our technology. And somewhere right now, beneath layers of steel and liquid nitrogen colder than the surface of Pluto, dozens of silent brains are waiting patiently for those limits to disappear. Still, unmoving, perfectly preserved, like messages from the past, addressed to a future that hasn't decided yet whether it truly wants to read them.